There are treasures too small to hold and too dangerous to keep. When a rare stamp surfaces in New York's collector circles, it brings with it whispers of forgery, greed, and a curse that no one can quite define. What begins as a polite consultation soon unravels into a web of deceit, where obsession is worth more than truth, and beauty hides its own kind of violence. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. When I walked into the front room that Thursday morning at 9:06, I didn't expect to find an auburn-haired stranger sitting on Wolfe's davenport like it was her own private throne. She was the type who wears expensive perfume too lightly and a coat too well to be from the boroughs. Her hat had a veil. That's not a metaphor. It actually had a veil. "I take it you aren't a messenger," I said, staying by the door. "No," she replied, "but you must be Mr. Goodwin." I didn't confirm. If someone's sitting in the brownstone uninvited before breakfast, I expect at least one reason, preferably written and notarized. Instead, she opened her handbag and drew out a crisp, cream-colored envelope. "My name is Margaret Vale. I'm here about a collection, and possibly a curse. If you've worked with Nero Wolfe long enough, you know when a case walks in wearing Chanel and mystery." I offered her a chair, but not a coffee. She wasn't here for hospitality. "Let's see what kind of curse we're talking about," I said. I didn't know yet that she meant it literally. She handed me a photo, an old one, of a man in pince-nez, holding a stamp album like it was the Holy Grail. The sort of gentleman who probably alphabetized his breakfast. "My uncle, Louis Vale," she said. "He died 6 weeks ago. Heart failure. Natural, by all accounts." "And yet," I prompted, waiting for the punchline. "The collection passed to me. Shortly after, 2 men who tried to acquire parts of it met untimely ends. One of them collapsed at an auction house in Chelsea. The other—" She hesitated. "Suffocated in his apartment. Gas leak." "And you're thinking the stamps did it?" She didn't blink. "I'm thinking someone else might think so." Now, I'm not allergic to superstition, only the kind that expects you to pay up front. But her tone wasn't frightened. It was factual. Like she was presenting Wolfe with a weather report, partly homicidal, with a chance of blackmail. I asked the obvious. "Why come to us?" "I want answers, before someone decides I'm next." I leaned back. It wasn't the first time someone tried to sell a murder by mailing it special delivery. But Miss Vale's package came with a little too much poise for coincidence. She wasn't scared. That was the part that made me sit up inside, even if I looked casual leaning on the armrest. Most people who walk in claiming there's a curse expect you to believe it, or laugh them out the door. Margaret Vale didn't care what I believed. She was here to document something. "There's nothing in the papers," I said. "No coverage of mysterious stamp deaths." "That's precisely the problem," she replied. Both men had connections to the collection, quietly. One was an anonymous bidder. The other had been cataloguing it off the record. "You've done your homework." "I've had time," she said. "And I want to know what I've inherited, before someone takes it the wrong way." The way she said inherited told me all I needed. She didn't want it. Not really. She wanted control over it. There's a difference. I jotted her details in my notebook, though I already had the picture memorized. Stylish, smart, and about as shaken as a lamppost. Something in her voice told me she wasn't afraid for her life. She was afraid of what the collection meant, and who might want to redefine it. "Start with the bidder," I said. "Raymond Dulcie," she replied. He tried to purchase Lot 47 at a private auction, one of the more obscure British Guianas. He collapsed 20 minutes after placing his bid. Stroke, they said. And the other? Nigel Brum, independent appraiser, had done some work for my uncle 2 years ago. He offered to review the collection again after the estate passed to me. 3 days later, He was found unconscious in his shop. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Faulty heater. That's convenient, I said. She nodded. But there's more. Brum left me a message before he died. It said, "One stamp doesn't belong. Don't trust the catalogue." Well, that was charming. A riddle from the grave wrapped in gummed paper. I asked if she brought the collection. "No," she said. "It's in a vault." Smart. She met my eye. "I don't think this is just about money, Mr. Goodwin." I had to agree. A man doesn't risk forgery, fraud, and murder for face value, unless the stamp's hiding more than a cancellation date. If she was lying, she was world class. But I didn't think she was lying. I thought she was leaving things out, which in this racket is practically a love letter. When Wolfe made his entrance, Margaret Vale stood up like someone had entered a courtroom, not a living room. That happens a lot. He gave her one glance, up, down, neutral, and took his chair. "I dislike mythology," he said. "Mr. Goodwin tells me you believe in curses." She didn't flinch. "I believe in leverage, and someone else might be using it." That earned her 10 seconds more than most. Wolfe laced his fingers over his gut. She laid out the rest. The vault, the strange deaths, the message from Brum. Then came the pièce de résistance. My uncle's final will had a page removed, the one detailing the stamp collection. Wolfe's eyes narrowed a fraction. "Removed when?" "No one knows. The page number is skipped. It was only noticed by the probate lawyer, who thought it was a clerical error." "There is no such thing," Wolfe said. "Archie Goodwin Rule No. 4. If Wolfe sits forward in his chair, something just caught fire, intellectually. He didn't accept the case, not yet. But when he asked her to list the appraisers by name, I knew the door had opened. And when he asked for beer before lunch, I knew it was personal. "Miss Vale," Wolfe said, "you have not requested bodyguards, surveillance, or police consultation. Why?" "Because I don't believe I'm the target." "But you said someone may believe you are." "That's different." He looked at her, then at me, then back to her. "You are not here out of fear," he said. "You are here to preserve the integrity of something you did not build, and do not want, but cannot ignore." She blinked. "Once. Correct." That earned her half a nod. Wolfe doesn't respect many people, but he appreciates clarity. "Mr. Goodwin will call you tomorrow," Wolfe said. "If I take the case, I will require access to the collection." She stood, gathering her gloves. "Thank you." She left no card. Just a shadow of something sharp, like a perfume that lingered behind to make a point. After she was gone, Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. "Archie," he murmured. "There is a lie in the room." It arrived after she left. Fritz served buttered parsnips with trout meunière that day. Wolfe barely tasted it, which is a statement of religious disturbance. "She is not fearful," Wolfe said. "She is furious at being implicated in something she doesn't understand." "And the collection?" "Ah," he raised a finger. "That, I suspect, is the bait." I nodded. "What's the hook?" Wolfe didn't answer. He picked up his beer with the solemnity of a man negotiating with fate. I left him there and returned to my desk, flipping through the notes she hadn't handed me. Auction dates, old appraisals, clipped clippings. One stamp caught my eye. It was never officially appraised, and the man who saw it last was dead. I handed Wolfe the coroner's report on Lewis Vale along with a copy of the will, both printed on paper thick enough to make Fritz nervous about how close they were to food. Wolfe took them without comment, lowered himself into his chair like it owed him deference, and began reading with that silent grimace he reserves for anything involving sudden death, poor grammar, or both. "The cause of death is consistent," he muttered. "Cardiac arrest. But note, no prior history, no complaint, no incident in preceding weeks." "Clean living catches up to a man," I offered. He flicked a finger. Silence. The will was more interesting. Wolfe flipped through it slowly, murmuring under his breath. When he hit the distribution of personal effects, specifically the stamp collection, his index finger paused in the margin like it had found something distasteful. "There is a textual inconsistency," he said. "Here, the structure shifts from direct bequest to conditional phrasing." "Which means what?" I asked. "It means either a poor draft or a later edit by a less skilled hand." I was about to respond when he looked up sharply. "And the catalogue?" That's when I knew we weren't done with the dead man yet. Lewis Vale didn't leave much behind other than stamps, questions, and a housekeeper who refused to open her door when I rang it 3 times in succession. According to the records I dug up, public and otherwise, the man had no spouse, no siblings, and a social calendar as blank as Wolfe's opinion of Kramer's deductive methods. The neighbors described him as quiet, which usually means either a serial killer or someone with good blackout curtains. In Vale's case, it was probably both, minus the murder. No debts, no lawsuits, no enemies. Which, to my mind, was suspicious in itself. A man who deals in paper squares, worth more than rare diamonds, should have at least one disgruntled bidder in his wake. As for the housekeeper, Miss Fernie Long, she reportedly called in sick the day after Vale died and hadn't been back since. I left a note, discreetly folded, which I didn't expect to see again. "Nothing?" Wolfe asked when I returned. "Only that his ghost is neater than his life," I replied. He nodded, as if that were the most damning thing so far. Back at the brownstone, I placed the stamped catalogue, Vale's original, not a reproduction, on Wolfe's desk like it was a ticking bomb with a perforated edge. He adjusted his glasses and turned the pages with the delicate irritation of a man touching something offensive but legally necessary. He stopped abruptly. "Page 32 is missing," he said. "It jumps straight from 31 to 33, I confirmed. "No tear, no crease, just a ghost page." Wolfe didn't speak for a moment. He tapped his thumb twice, which is Wolfen for, well. "It is not merely absent," he murmured. "It was never numbered. You're saying someone pulled it out before it was printed?" "I am suggesting," he said slowly, "that a page was removed and the renumbering was bypassed. I had to admit, it was a neat trick, one you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it." Which, conveniently, Margaret Vale hadn't been. Wolfe closed the catalogue and leaned back, steepling his fingers. "One stamp too many, or one too few. Either is dangerous, Mr. Goodwin, especially if it changes the story." That particular story, I could tell, was just beginning to ink itself in. Wolfe spent the next 20 minutes reading the coroner's minute-by-minute timeline, with me chiming in where needed and Fritz chiming in not at all, which meant he'd taken the conversation as officially sealed off from the kitchen. "The body was found fully clothed," I said. "At the desk, with the ledger open. Lights were on, door was locked from the inside." Wolfe raised a brow. "A pose. More than that, the stamps he'd sorted were laid out precisely. No fingerprints but his." "And the drawer?" he asked. "Locked, burned envelope inside. What was left of it?" "Contents." I shrugged. "Ash." Now Wolfe's line between suicide and murder isn't philosophical, it's grammatical. If a man prepares his death with this much narrative flair, Wolfe calls it a literary act, not a medical one. "There is a flavour of orchestration," he said, "a tableau rather than despair." I jotted that down, not because I needed it, but because Wolfe's words sometimes age like fine wine or bad cheese, depending on the day. The trouble was, someone had set the scene like a collector pins butterflies, just enough order to cover a killing. I took a cab to Lexington Avenue and pushed open the warped door of Brum's Stamps and Curiosities, which smelled like cedar, regret, and the back end of a filing cabinet. Nigel Brum looked like the love child of a dusty ledger and a Victorian umbrella. He recognized me, barely, and waved me in with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for unpaid bills. "I'm not appraising anything," he barked. "I've retired." "Good for you," I said. "I'm not selling anything. I just want to talk about Lewis Vale." That earned a twitch in the left eyebrow. Broom, when prompted, admitted he'd evaluated part of the Vale collection the previous year. Under the table, no receipt, which meant he either got paid in cash, stamps, or both. "Is it true," I asked, "that you called it cursed?" He muttered something about blood on paper and things that shouldn't exist. Clarify? Instead, he reached for a drawer, paused and said, "Some stamps don't just tell history, they hide it." Which, I thought, was exactly the kind of phrase people say right before they stop talking entirely. Broom leaned in as if the stamps had ears. "There was one," he said. "A British colonial. Impossible watermark. Shouldn't have existed. You authenticated it?" I refused to. That took me back half a pace. Stamp guys don't walk away from prestige. They wrap it in cellophane. I told Vale to remove it. He didn't. Said he had plans. What kind? Private auction, sealed bids, no publicity. And then? Broom didn't answer. He was watching the street through the blinds, his hands tight around a half-empty tea mug. "I won't touch that collection again," he muttered. "If you're smart, you'll tell the woman to burn the lot before it burns her." "Who exactly is burning?" "Doesn't matter," he said. "It started." That was it. He stood, turned the sign to closed, and ushered me out like I was death's delivery boy. On the sidewalk, I made a note to ask Wolfe what kind of man builds his own ghost story and then forgets to leave the lights on. I got back in time for lunch, veal medallions with capers, which Fritz served with all the quiet dignity of a man who pretends he doesn't hear words like curse or blood-stained stamp. Wolfe, halfway through his second helping, set his fork down. "Well, Broom says there's a stamp that shouldn't exist, refused to verify it. Claims Vale was planning a secret sale." Wolfe snorted. "A secret sale of a fantasy? Bah. He says it's cursed." He sipped beer. "Curses are the refuge of the unimaginative, or the guilty. Or," I said, "the desperate." He looked at me. "More likely, someone has created a myth to conceal a motive. Superstition is very convenient, Mr. Goodwin, especially when it discourages scrutiny. Or collectors. Or heirs." He stood, an act as rare as snowfall in July, and walked to the orchid room. He stayed there 5 minutes longer than usual. When he returned, he looked thoughtful and dryly amused. "Should I call Kramer?" I asked. Wolfe sat. "Not until someone dies again." He lifted his glass. "Or worse, comes back to life." And that, I admit, made the veal taste just a little less savoury. If you want to find fear wrapped in velvet, start on the 18th floor of the Wilshire Building, 5th Avenue. Kingsley Grote's office had the kind of architectural ego you only get from architects with no supervision. Sweeping windows, imported wood panels, and a Persian rug that probably cost more than my annual salary, adjusted for inflation and insult. But money doesn't lie. It just sweats when it's cornered. A receptionist with cheekbones like parentheses showed me in without asking who I was. That's how you know someone's waiting. Grote's handshake was dry, precise, and 1 second too long. He looked the way rich men are supposed to look, tan, tailored, and terrified someone's going to find out what they did to get there. "I appreciate you coming," he said, guiding me to a chair designed more for intimidation than comfort. "I gather this is about the Vale collection." "You gather right," I said. "And you offered to buy it. Big." That didn't make him blink, but his grip tightened on the decanter he wasn't drinking from. "I did offer double," Grote said smoothly, pouring 2 fingers of scotch for show. "And I rarely offer once." "Magnanimous," I said. He allowed himself a smile. "I'm not used to being refused." "No one is. You just happen to pay more when it happens." The scotch stayed on the table, untouched. He sat across from me like a man sitting opposite himself in a chess match. The truth is, I would have gone higher, but I started to hear things, voices, incidents. He rattled them off, a dealer in Boston who'd tripped on his own staircase after appraising part of the Vale lot, a curator who passed out in the subway after handling 2 envelopes, none fatal, all inconvenient. "And you called it off?" I asked. "I'm a collector," he said, "not a martyr." It was rehearsed. A collector who stops collecting because of rumors is like Wolfe skipping lunch due to bad weather. Possible, but unnatural. And if Grote was lying, he was spending a lot of money to make it look like caution. Grote leaned forward with the gravity of a man delivering eulogies at his own wedding. "It wasn't just the accidents," he said. "It was the pattern. Every man who tried to trace the full chain of ownership got tangled." I nodded. "You mean dead?" He winced, like I'd said something vulgar. "Well, yes. Or ruined." The phrasing was careful, polished. Not how a man remembers things, but how he prepares them. "There was a stamp," he added, almost as an afterthought. "So rare that even the British Museum hasn't confirmed it exists. A queen's head with inverted watermark, blue on red. It was whispered about, never catalogued." "And you saw it?" "No. But I know people who did, and they're quieter now." He smiled with a melancholic grace, which might have been tragic if it hadn't smelled like marketing. "I'd met 100 liars and 2 good actors. Grote was trying to be both. He was selling fear like it was porcelain, fragile, exquisite, and limited edition." "That's a beautiful story," I said. "You should charge admission." Grote's smile faltered. "You don't believe in patterns." "I believe in motive. You made an offer, it got refused, and then suddenly the collection starts collecting corpses." He stiffened, just enough for me to notice. "I withdrew my offer before the misfortunes." "According to?" "My correspondence." "Which you keep on site, I imagine." The decanter clinked as he reached to straighten it. By reflex, or to keep his hands from shaking, I couldn't tell. I leaned in. "Let me ask it plain. Are you afraid of the stamp, or the woman who owns it?" That got him. His throat clicked once. Then he reached for a folder and opened it to letters, typewritten, stamped, dated. But his fingers trembled slightly on the edges. Grote didn't deal in rare paper because he loved history. He did it because he understood how value clings to mystery. But now he was the one being appraised. And from where I sat, something didn't quite match the provenance. Grote handed over a neat sheaf of paper, 2 letters, both dated a week apart, both declaring his withdrawal from any further bid on the Vale collection. It was clean, professional, and, according to Wolfe's notes, completely off by 3 days. "You mailed these when?" I asked. "They were hand-delivered." "By?" "My secretary. She's since moved to Chicago." Naturally. I read the signatures, initials, notations, everything to make it look official. It might have fooled a probate lawyer. It wouldn't fool Wolfe. And it didn't. Fool me. I folded the letters and handed them back with a polite nod. "Appreciate the clarity." Grote looked relieved, which told me he shouldn't be. If you're innocent and relieved by paperwork, odds are good you aren't innocent. You're just glad the paper's still there. I was halfway to the door when Grote dropped his voice. "You want to know the truth," he said. "The collection isn't the problem. It's the woman guarding it." I turned. "Miss Vale?" "She doesn't understand what she's holding. Or maybe she does too well." His tone shifted, soft, almost reverent, or bitter. "Sometimes it's the same thing." "She wouldn't sell," he said. "Wouldn't even let me see the full index. Just told me the vault was sealed until the estate settled." "Which you tried to speed up?" He didn't answer, but I noticed the way his eyes narrowed, not at me, but at the memory. Collectors hate being denied, especially by someone who isn't playing the game. When I left, I made a mental note. Whatever Margaret Vale was protecting, it wasn't just inheritance. It was the kind of power that makes men like Grote grind their teeth in silk gloves. Wolfe had just finished his second bottle of beer when I gave him the full rundown. He didn't interrupt, which meant either he was impressed or calculating a source for Grote's liver. "He is not a murderer," Wolfe said finally, "but he would applaud one. He's scared." "He's afraid of being irrelevant," Wolfe corrected. "The collection has become myth, and he cannot control myth. That offends him." "He lied about the letters." "Yes, because he is guilty of wanting too much." Wolfe reached for a third beer, a rare indulgence outside summer. "It is not belief in a curse that matters," he mused. "It is how quickly a man will act on someone else's." Before I could reply, the phone rang. Wolfe's eyes flicked to me. "Answer it," he said. "If it's Kramer, he'll be loud. If it's urgent, he'll be louder." It was both. And this time, he had something we hadn't expected. Grote had just received a death threat, written on stamp paper. Wolfe had the late Mr. Vale's stamp catalogue open across his desk, like a sacred manuscript. He was leaning over it with a scowl of such focused disapproval that I knew something had turned up. Either that, or Fritz had burned the toast, which for Wolfe was equally tragic. "This entry," he said, tapping the column with one thick forefinger. "Lot 62. I glanced. It looked like the rest. Fine italics, careful description, denomination, colour, and a neat appraisal value just shy of $4,000. "Handsome number," I offered. "Yes," Wolfe murmured, "but undocumented." I squinted closer. No origin date, no issuing authority. Not even a cancellation or provenance. Just the barest details, what it looked like, what it might be worth, and nothing else. "In a catalogue compiled by Vale himself," Wolfe said. "This is an omission with intent. He knew what he had, or what someone wanted others to think he had." "Forgery?" "Possibly, but if so, it was inserted, not fabricated." The difference mattered. One implied skill, the other suggested a plot. And if someone was plotting with postage, they weren't just licking envelopes, they were sealing fate. We didn't wait long to ring Miss Vale. Wolfe preferred face-to-face, but in this instance, a telephone silence would prove just as illuminating. "Miss Vale," Wolfe said, "do you recall a crimson New Brunswick halfpenny with a reversed watermark, catalogued as Lot 62? There was a pause. Not long. But not short enough for someone who'd supposedly inherited, insured, and inventoried the whole collection. "No," she said. "I don't recall that one." "Of course," Wolfe replied, in the tone he used for failing sous chefs and probate lawyers. "I may have missed it," she added. "There were hundreds of entries." "Yes, but this one is singular in lacking any contextual data." Another pause. "I'm sorry. I'll have to check the vault." "No need," Wolfe said, and ended the call with such finality that even the dial tone seemed sheepish. I raised an eyebrow. "She lied," Wolfe said. "Because she planted it?" "No, because someone did, and she knows who." He didn't need her to confess. He only needed her to misplace her memory at the right moment, and she had. If Wolfe wanted confirmation, I knew just the man, a retired postal historian named Haldeman, who kept a cubbyhole on the east side stuffed with more obscure paper than the Library of Congress and less dust than Broom's tea kettle. Haldeman looked at the photo I brought like it owed him money. "Interesting," he said. "You're sure this was catalogued by Louis Vale?" "His typewriter, his handwriting, his collection." He snorted. "Then he made a mistake, or a move. That watermark was abandoned in 1912. It only shows up in the Liscombe forgeries." "Liscombe?" I asked. "A Canadian stamp fraud ring. They produced 10, maybe 12 false rarities. Most were caught. One batch disappeared entirely." "Which batch?" "That one," he said, tapping the stamp's image. "That's not a collectible, it's a ghost." I thanked him and made my way back to the brownstone, chewing on the thought that ghosts, once named, tend to stir. And someone had stirred this one just enough to make it fatal. Wolfe didn't even grunt when I returned. He merely extended his hand for the notes, skimmed them, and then leaned back with the pleased scorn of a man finding a typo in the Bible. "So," he said, "a known forgery line, abandoned a century ago, resurrected with precise intent. Could have fooled a room full of experts," I offered. "Yes, but that wasn't the goal. This was not planted to sell. It was planted to prove something." "Such as?" "That the collection contained something truly unique, unverifiable, dangerous." He poured beer and let that settle, both in glass and mind. "Consider," he said, "if Vale never intended to sell, but someone else wanted the appearance of value to spike, to auction it after his death." "Precisely. And if someone tried to stop it, they'd need removing." We both paused. "You're saying," I ventured, "someone is rewriting value by rewriting history?" Wolfe nodded. "Greed distorts price, vanity distorts fact. But when both converge on a single item, it ceases to be a stamp and becomes a trigger." He raised his glass. "We are not hunting a killer, Mr. Goodwin. We are chasing a fictionist." I dialed Brum's number from Wolfe's office, half expecting a dial tone and half hoping for a ghost. To my surprise, he answered. "Mr. Brum," I said. "Archie Goodwin here. We met in your shop." "Yes," he croaked. "What do you want?" I kept it friendly. "Just a small clarification. The Vale stamp, lot 62. Did you appraise it?" Silence. "I saw the collection," he muttered. "That stamp wasn't there." "Sure?" I would have remembered. I waited. He didn't add anything. His breathing was uneven, like he'd walked too far or run from something that had caught up anyway. "Look," I said. "Can we meet? Just 10 minutes." "No," he snapped. "Don't come here." "Why not?" He hung up. Wolfe looked up from his desk. I relayed the exchange. "He's frightened," Wolfe said. "Of what?" "Correction," Wolfe replied, "which means something he believed has been disproved, or something he appraised has turned out to be the lever to murder." We dined that afternoon on braised duck with tarragon and a suspicion of fennel. Wolfe was mostly silent until the second course, when he wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and decided to philosophize. "Forgery," he said, "is the sincerest form of murder." I chewed and waited. With Wolfe, you don't interrupt when he's just given you a thesis sentence. "Why murder?" I asked. "Seems more like theft." "No, theft takes value. Forgery imposes false value. It replaces truth with intention. It rewrites the past in its author's image." "Still sounds like theft, just with a pen." He sipped beer. "The pen is a weapon, Mr. Goodwin, and whoever wields it believes themselves cleverer than consequence." I raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning that if the man who forged that catalogue entry is still adjusting the narrative, he will not stop at stamps." "You expect another body?" "I expect a correction. And men like that," he said, cutting into his duck, "prefer red ink." The call came, just as Wolfe had dozed off in the plant room. Fritz had gone to refresh the orchid misters, and I was reviewing Brum's last appraisal notes. The voice on the line was high, brittle. "This is Terence, from Brum's." "Brum's what?" "Shop. I found him. He's not dead, I don't think, but..." "Where?" "On the floor. The door was locked from the inside." I was on my feet. "Anything near him?" "There's a torn envelope." That did it. I told him to keep the door closed, wait for the ambulance, and not touch a damn thing unless it started talking. When I hung up, Wolfe had appeared silently behind me. He does that, about twice a year, and it always lowers my life expectancy. He said nothing. But the look told me. This time, the fiction had drawn blood. "He was silenced," Wolfe said. "Not killed. Yet. But removed." I nodded. "You're saying Brum knew it didn't belong?" "Yes, but that's irrelevant now." "How's that?" "Because the forgery," Wolfe said, "was never the stamp." He walked to the safe, removed the catalogue, and held it up like a loaded pistol. "This is the forgery. The catalogue. The record. The story. Someone is killing, Wolfe said quietly, not to protect truth, but to assert authorship. That was Wolfe's flavour of outrage, cool, calm, and Latin-rooted. Mr. Goodwin, he said, taking his seat, when falsehood breeds value, men will kill not for money, but for correction. And somewhere between ink and blood, someone had done exactly that. If Wolfe ever decided to rearrange the furniture downstairs, it wouldn't be for comfort or fashion. It would be for the same reason he seated our 6 guests that evening the way he did: deliberate mischief. The round dining table had been extended just enough to make eye contact inevitable, but not quite comfortable. Grote was placed beside Margaret Vale, though Wolfe surely knew the two had quarrelled over the final auction lot. On Grote's left, Tobin Heller, whose darting eyes gave away more than his polite silence. Lattimore, across from Grote, had no view of the orchids in the corner, but plenty of Grote's moustache. Wolfe, of course, had the head seat. I had the foot, which meant my job wasn't digestion, but observation. Every movement, fork pause, throat clear, and forced toast was a clue, and Wolfe's layout made sure the tension circulated like Fritz's wine. In measured, slow pause, just enough to loosen lips, not to soothe. Fritz's veal osso buco had a reputation that extended past state lines. He served it that night with risotto alla Milanese and a quiet dignity, nodding once as each plate landed, like a conductor ensuring the first note struck true. Wolfe, napkin squared, took a single bite, closed his eyes, and opened his mouth for a different kind of course. A forgery, he said, as if we'd all agreed on the topic, requires not only skill, but nerve. The sort of nerve, one imagines, cultivated over time by proximity to genuine artistry, or genuine ambition. A cough followed, dry and brief. Grote's, unmistakably. Ambition, Wolfe continued, dabbing his lip, is not inherently suspicious, but it does frequently dine with opportunity. No one responded. The silence was respectful, or perhaps strategic. The veal cooled more than it should have, and I noticed Margaret had barely touched hers. Tobin Heller, whom I'd mentally dubbed the choir boy of the philatelic apocalypse, waited until Wolfe addressed him directly. "You were present," Wolfe said, "when Mr. Grote inspected the 1868 inverted centre." "Yes, sir." I brought him the cataloguing notes and opened the vault drawer. "And what struck you about the stamp?" Its placement mostly. Not its rarity?" "Well, I mean, I knew it was important, but Mr. Lattimore said—" Wolfe lifted a finger, and Tobin stopped mid-backpedal. "I ask what you noticed, not what you were told to notice." Tobin blinked. "It was old, scented strangely." Wolfe let the silence breathe before pressing. "The date of its previous listing?" I don't recall." "Yet you handled the catalogue?" "Yes." Wolfe's lips curled slightly. "Indeed, a curious assistant, neither forgetful nor informed." Tobin looked like a boy caught, holding the wrong hymn book, and knowing it. Margaret Vale had spent more time pushing her fork through the saffron rice than actually eating it. When Wolfe asked, "Miss Vale, your uncle catalogued the rarest lots himself, did he not?" She straightened, nodding. "Yes, always. He didn't trust just anyone with the top pieces." "And the 1868? "That was one of his last entries. He worked late the night before the auction." "Alone?" Her eyes flicked sideways, then down. "Well, he said he'd be alone." Wolfe's tone was mild. "You visited him?" "No, I mean, I saw him the next morning. He looked tired. From late work, but the stamp was already affixed in the folio. Curious." She set her fork down. He must have done it early that morning." "Indeed. Early work, yet no coffee stains. Your uncle was known for his 3-cup ritual." Margaret's hands curled in her lap. I suspected it wasn't just the veal that unsettled her digestion. Grote wiped his mouth with the kind of flourish that hoped to conceal discomfort. "I withdrew my offer before the sale closed," he declared. "Curious," I said. Because the note you sent arrived at 9:17. The auction closed at 9. He blinked. No, that can't be. I made the call at 8:40. Called whom? Wolfe asked. Grote fumbled. Lattimore. I told him to withdraw it. Lattimore raised a brow. That's not how we close bids, Grote, and you know it. Grote turned red. It was a gesture, he snapped. A late gesture, Wolfe mused. So you regret the offer. Why? Grote glanced toward Margaret. A subtle, split-second flicker. It didn't feel right. Not legally or morally? Grote's jaw clenched. Both. Wolfe nodded. Then you are doubly unfortunate. The law accepts neither regret nor implication. His napkin remained untouched, and his appetite never quite returned. Lattimore, who had approached the meal like a man trying to turn veal into profit, finally leaned in. There was no forgery when I listed the piece, he said. Wolfe tilted his head. You noted its provenance, from the Kessler estate. Correct. Kessler never owned the 1868. I went by the markings. Wolfe smiled faintly. Not the markings, the narrative. Forged narratives are harder to detect than forged ink. Lattimore spread his palms. I never saw the stamp before the catalogue went out. But you inspected the folio. Yes. Wolfe's voice dropped half a tone. And you noticed the seal? Lattimore's silence wasn't long, but it was heavy. I noticed it had a seal, not the seal. A distinction only the knowledgeable make, Wolfe said, and rarely announce. Lattimore lifted his wineglass and drank, slowly. Fritz reappeared with a tray of brandied pears, an indulgence Wolfe deemed an acceptable deviation from the season. As they were served, Wolfe let the conversation lull, only to pierce it with quiet elegance. Fear, like brandy, has a tendency to linger, and both can sweeten the tongue or scald the throat. That one landed. Margaret's spoon clinked too hard against her dish. Grote coughed again, though nothing had gone down wrong. But it was Lattimore who asked, Are we nearly done? Fatigued? Wolfe asked. No, just... He checked his watch. Another appointment. Wolfe inclined his head. Certainly, we mustn't obstruct commerce. Lattimore stood too quickly, declined the pear, and made for the door. The brandy had done its job. It had clarified something, even if not the palate. I waited a full 30 seconds after Lattimore exited before making my move. Wolfe didn't nod. He didn't have to. I got my hat, slipped out, and followed. Lattimore didn't head for a cab or corner. He turned left, past the fire hydrant, and walked 3 blocks to where a green Packard waited. He wasn't alone. A woman, tall, veiled, opened the door for him. From the angle, I couldn't catch a full face, but I caught a gesture. She gripped his wrist, firm and urgent. They didn't speak. They drove off. I took out my pad and jotted the license. NY4N3328. Then I ducked into the deli and used their payphone to ring Lon Cohen, just in case that plate ever needed explaining. Back at the brownstone, Fritz raised an eyebrow as I returned. Wolfe, already back at his beer, didn't look up. He didn't need to. Wolfe took a sip, then said with maddening calm, One of them is lying with exquisite precision. Tomorrow we learn whether it was for profit or protection. The front door rattled under a fist that had no interest in patience or politeness. Fritz had just stepped out to get fresh parsley, so it was left to me to intercept the hurricane that blew in, wearing a brown overcoat and a badge. I cracked the door open and let the draft in. Inspector Kramer, I said, with the kind of smile that tends to wrinkle his mood further. You know, I keep a chair warm just for you. He brushed past me, like I'd been mistaken for a lamppost, muttering something about warrants and obstruction. I didn't hear the details, but the tone was standard. I followed him in, hands in pockets. Wolfe, naturally, didn't bother to stand. He tilted his head, nostrils flaring like he'd sniffed a subpar truffle. Inspector, do sit. Your arrival, though unheralded, is unlikely to be brief. Kramer dropped into the red chair, like a man collapsing into a confession booth, except his sins wore other people's names. From his coat, he pulled a slim folder and tossed it with the grace of a bricklayer onto Wolfe's desk. Grote's calls put him at the hotel at all the right times. The stamp that disappeared shows up in his suitcase. And get this, one fingerprint, half burned, on the edge of an appraisal slip that someone thought they could torch. His print. Wolfe sighed, not out of frustration, but boredom. His thumb tapped twice on the armrest, an orchestral cue for balderdash. I took a seat near the window, ready to enjoy the show. Kramer was circling the gallows, and Wolfe was already eyeing the floorboards. "And you believe this satisfies the burden of proof?" Wolfe asked, voice syrupy with disdain. Kramer's eyes narrowed into gun barrels. Wolfe's fingers laced together over his midsection like they were protecting sacred ground. "Assume," he began. "Mr. Grote orchestrated this theft. Why then would he engineer circumstances to disqualify his own bid? Why burn the slip? Why plant the stamp where it could be found? He gains nothing. He loses opportunity." Kramer grunted. "He panicked. People do." "Yes, but rarely with such deliberate choreography," Wolfe said. "There's a coherence to this chaos that offends logic. The sequence of events is too orderly, the errors too symmetrical. Even fools leave jagged edges." I watched the corners of Kramer's mouth twitch like they were auditioning for a growl. Wolfe pressed on, undeterred. "If Mr. Grote is guilty, he is the most conveniently careless mastermind I've encountered. That, Inspector, offends me." Kramer reached for his cigar, the one he always chewed more than lit, and clamped it between his molars like a bulldog considering a telegram. "You got a better theory?" "I have a better skepticism," Wolfe replied. He flicked the folder with a fingertip. "All of your conclusions depend upon inferential linkage. You presume the slip was burned by Grote. You assume the stamp was in his possession at dinner. You trust that the calls indicate intent rather than coincidence." Kramer shifted. "We've got physical evidence, which may have been placed. Planted evidence is not evidence. It is narrative with fingerprints." The tip of Wolfe's finger tapped twice more. "You are not advancing justice, Inspector. You are following a script you were handed, and I suspect the playwright is in the cast." Kramer's teeth met his cigar like they meant to strangle it. I cleared my throat, more for punctuation than necessity. "If I may, Inspector, this case is almost polite." Kramer turned to glare. I shrugged. "Too neat. Too fast. You ever follow a guy in snow and all his prints go in a straight line? That's not walking. That's sweeping. This trail, it's been swept." Wolfe nodded, not at me, but at the logic. "Indeed. The question is not how Grote could be so careless, but why the evidence is so obliging." Kramer bit down harder. I half expected his cigar to emit a final squeak. "Grote's no angel," I added. "But this smells like someone wanted him not just suspected, but packaged." "Gift-wrapped," Wolfe murmured, "and delivered." "I will say this plainly," Wolfe stated. "Mr. Grote has been framed." Kramer opened his mouth, but Wolfe raised a hand. "Not perhaps. Certainly. The method is precise. The intention, unmistakable. And—" Here he turned ever so slightly toward the orchids, as though they were entitled to the truth too. "The author of this deception was almost certainly present at that dinner." Kramer spat. "Then name names." "No," Wolfe said. "Not yet." He closed the file with the delicacy of a judge folding a verdict in half. "Speculation is not a luxury I afford myself before lunch." Kramer's face turned an interesting hue, not yet named by Crayola. "Damn it, Wolfe." "Inspector," Wolfe said coolly, "damnation is a conclusion. I am still conducting my inquiry." As Kramer launched into a protest fit for City Hall, the phone rang. I excused myself with a little bow and lifted the receiver. "Goodwin." Margaret's voice came fast and brittle. "Archie, someone's broken into Uncle Grote's safe. Last night. We just found it open. Nothing else disturbed. Just the safe." I covered the mouthpiece. "Wolfe?" He nodded once, eyes still on Kramer. Details. I returned to Margaret. Was anything taken? We don't know yet. But the lock. It was forced. Clean. I hung up and turned back into the room. Newsflash, gentlemen. Last night someone cracked Grote's safe. Kramer cursed under his breath. Wolfe didn't speak. He stood. He stood. Which, if you know Wolfe, was the equivalent of a siren. Someone, he said, with a gravity that turned the room still, is no longer hiding. They are erasing. Wolfe, as ever, had taken up his post beneath the glass canopy of the plant room, among his orchids and his convictions. He had refused lunch, which by itself was worth a headline. I had taken the liberty of making myself a sandwich with Fritz's reluctant blessing, and returned just in time to hear Wolfe pick up a thought where, I assume, he had left it an hour prior. Collectors, Mr. Goodwin, he said without turning, his voice slightly muffled by the humid air, are often misidentified as enthusiasts. They are not. They are preservers of illusion. The illusion that perfection, once obtained, can be made eternal. I was about to ask whether that included orchid maniacs who refused to entertain subpoenas, but I didn't want to risk the sandwich. Wolfe continued, and when that illusion is threatened, when the object betrays its myth, some will act not as custodians, but as executioners, not to protect value, Archie, to protect the lie. He reached out with absurd gentleness and adjusted a blossom no one but he would have known was off balance. It seemed we were no longer discussing flowers. You assume, Wolfe said, that the forged provenance was intended to deceive men like Mr. Lattimore. That would be plausible, were Lattimore a fool. He is not. He had shuffled back to the red chair, forearms on the armrests like a monarch without a kingdom. The fabrication was crude, almost performative. Its purpose was not market deception. It was historical manipulation. Someone sought to rewrite not the stamp's price tag, but its story. I raised an eyebrow. Wolfe noticed. Suppose a scandal, he went on, attached to a particular item, not merely financial, but reputational. Suppose further that item remained in circulation, silent but dangerous. What would one do? Destroy it? Risk suspicion? Hide it? Risk rediscovery? No, one would cleanse it. And forging a fresh origin, I said, makes it reborn. Precisely. A new beginning, conspicuously unrelated to any damaging past. Except, of course, the past rarely stays buried, especially when men like Brum still breathe. He didn't need to say it. Brum had been smothered for what he remembered. I tried a long shot, mostly for sport. You're telling me this wasn't about cash? The stamp wasn't a payday. It was a panic. Wolfe's eyes narrowed, not in irritation, but in the satisfaction of a tutor watching his pupil finally jab the right button. Cash, Archie, is a consequence, not a cause. A collector may crave currency, but what he fears is exposure. Fraudulence is not merely a crime, it is a collapse. Collapse of what? Self, standing, identity. Prestige is a fragile facade. When threatened, the desperate will kill not for gain, but to protect the mythology they've constructed around themselves. He reached for a bottle of beer. The pop of the cap was punctuation. I've heard a lot of motives in that office. Jealousy, revenge, greed. But fear of being found out. That one tends to wear a better suit and come with club membership. Wolfe leaned forward, which in his case meant the matter had passed from theory to personal discomfort. That's roughly the equivalent of DEFCON 2 in the brownstone. Consider the chain of events, he murmured. The stamp appears for auction with a dubious backstory. Mr. Brum, the most vocal expert on the collection's true origins, is abruptly silenced. Mr. Grote, known for his skepticism, is framed. And Mr. Heller, whose role in the provenance process was supposedly clerical, just happened to have access to every stage of the forgery. I finished. Wolfe inclined his head. I could have danced a jig. He continued, yet no one remarks upon Mr. Heller's enthusiasm for the narrative. Too enthusiastic, as if he'd rehearsed not just his lines but everyone else's. You think he scripted the show? I think he adjusted the lighting, and the audience applauded the wrong actor. It was classic Wolfe. If everyone pointed to the same man, he suspected the hand that did the pointing. And somewhere in that pointing hand, there was ink, red, not black. I had to hand it to Wolfe. He didn't forget a detail, even one smuggled in on a silver voice and a trembling smile. Miss Henshaw, he said, claimed ignorance of the stamp's history, and yet, when discussing the collection, she spoke as one would of a beloved painting, not a family relic. I said, she used words like rarely seen and curated. Indeed, not inherited or my uncle's. She referred to the collection in institutional terms, as if she had once been its custodian, not merely its niece. Which meant either she'd studied hard for a role she didn't audition for, or she was hiding the depth of her involvement for reasons yet unspoken. And her surprise at the forged label, I asked. Wolfe shook his head slowly. She was not surprised. She was insulted. A forger's sin is not the deception. It is the incompetence. It wasn't the stamp that had exposed Margaret. It was the insult to her intelligence. Wolfe, in a moment of disarming candour, said, Archie, I have, on occasion, contemplated what I might do if one were to tamper with a Delilah hybrid and pass it off as a true Odontoglossum crispum. I didn't reply. When Wolfe goes metaphorical, it's best to let the orchid do the talking. He went on. It would not be the loss of value that offended me, nor the deception. It would be the desecration, the intrusion upon something I have preserved as pure. I asked, would you kill for it? He gave me a glance, not unkind, but entirely unamused. I would consider it. There it was, the line between man and myth, and Wolfe admitted he could straddle it if the stakes involved a genus. No one is immune to obsession, not even the man who trims orchids with surgical scissors. Wolfe reached for the phone with the gravity of a man ordering the final meal of a condemned guest. Call them, he said. Margaret, Grote, Latimore, Heller. Invite, not compel, but use a tone that suggests absence will be interpreted as confession. Classy, I said. You want them all here at once? Yes. Even if they end up strangling each other with tie clips? Yes. And I take it we're not offering sherry. He didn't dignify that with a response. His gaze was fixed not on me, but on something internal, a structure forming, the kind of architecture you can't see until it's lit by a final lie. I picked up the phone. You sure you want all four in the same room, boss? Wolfe didn't blink. Yes, and be prompt. This time, someone will lie too late. And if I knew Wolfe, and I did, he already knew which one. Wolfe rearranged the drawing room with the kind of precision usually reserved for trigonometry. The chairs had been there before, sure, but this time the angles were different. Not just for comfort, Wolfe doesn't give a hoot about comfort, but for vantage. Grote was across from Latimore, Margaret to Wolfe's left, and Tobin Heller dead centre, directly in Wolfe's line of fire, should he choose to pull the trigger with syllables. I stood where I usually do, behind Wolfe, leaning against the bookcase. It's a convenient perch when you're expecting someone to fall. Wolfe adjusted his cuffs, nodded once and began, not with a flourish, but a scalpel. It is, I assure you, Wolfe said, no minor feat to manufacture scarcity. But scarcity alone does not fetch millions. One must also curate absence. That got a blink from Grote and a twitch from Heller. Wolfe pressed on. The forged provenance, not merely a counterfeit trail, but an entire narrative architecture, was designed to anchor the auction's climax. The so-called Molnar Blue, an envelope once mailed from the Carpathians in 1872, was never mailed at all. It never existed, but it had to be missing. A ghost lot, a whisper among collectors, a gap in the ledger that begs to be filled with money. Latimore tried to scoff but settled for a throat clear. Wolfe continued, relentless. By implying the piece had once been sold, lost and nearly recovered, its phantom value grew. The stamp was not being found. It was being born. Grote narrowed his eyes. Margaret said nothing, and Hella, he fidgeted. That, from him, was practically a confession. The entire structure, Wolfe said, tilting his head slightly, required not only expertise, but desperation. His gaze landed on Hella like a velvet hammer. You, Mr. Hella, had both. A once esteemed appraiser turned advisory ghostwriter, bankrupt in dignity and finance. You had access to Brum's collection, access to the ledger Grote kept locked, and, more importantly, to the hopes of every man in this room. Hella's chin lifted a millimeter. You seeded the idea of the Molnar Blue into Lattimore's ear 2 years ago, then again into Grote's, subtly. A note here, a lunch conversation there. You knew the ghost of the stamp would stir rumours, and when the auction was scheduled, you only had to whisper once more for the myth to move. Wolfe paused. You orchestrated the curse not to destroy the auction, but to eliminate your competitors. Brum was first. The envelope was next. Hella opened his mouth. Nothing came out but silence and sweat. Wolfe reached to his left, where the worn appraisal ledger lay. His fingers tapped once, then stopped at a penciled note, underlined faintly. This entry, he said, dates the Molnar Blue's value assessment as June 9th of last year. Grote leaned forward. So, Wolfe said. The collector who claimed to have sold the stamp died the previous June 4th. Lattimore stiffened. Meaning, Wolfe went on, someone fabricated a posthumous certification, and only one man here had both the access and gall to forge that handwriting, while knowing the original was already ash. I watched Hella's left thumb twitch, then fold. Forgery, Wolfe said calmly, is an art, but dates, like corpses, resist persuasion. They stay dead. Grote exhaled through his nose. The air in the room felt like lacquer, glossy and thin. I cleared my throat, not theatrically, just enough to turn heads. One more stitch, I said. At that dinner, the night Brum keeled over from something stronger than indigestion, Mr. Hella left early. That's right, Lattimore muttered. He claimed migraines. Sure, I said. But migraines don't carry envelopes. He wasn't alone. Someone walked with him to his cab. That someone returned 20 minutes later, without a coat. Grote raised an eyebrow. I shrugged. The burned envelope we found at Brum's place smelled faintly of eucalyptus glue and lavender. Same mix as the stationery in Lattimore's study. You keep it sealed in cedar drawers, right? Lattimore stammered, but Wolfe waved him quiet. Not an accomplice, Wolfe said. A decoy. You, Mr. Lattimore, were a distraction. Lattimore gulped. Hella shifted again. You could feel it now, the rope tightening, one knot away from the drop. Margaret stood, slow and deliberate. Her eyes, unblinking, locked on Wolfe, then drifted to each man in the room. You're all wrong, she said softly. Not about the fraud. I see that now, but about the collection. Grote opened his mouth. She raised a hand. I'm donating it, all of it, to the Smithsonian. No auction, no curse, no pedigree. Let it be studied, not sold. Wolfe inclined his head, barely. I don't do it out of fear, she said, sharper now. I do it because none of you ever really owned it, not Brum, not me, not any of you. It belonged to the stories you told yourselves. The rest was paper. There was something in her voice, not rage, not pity, but the kind of clarity you only get after burning bridges you never built. Hella stood, or tried to. His knees betrayed him halfway up, so he ended in an awkward lean. I didn't mean, he began, voice dry as chalk. It wasn't supposed to go this far. No? Wolfe asked. I just wanted credit, acknowledgement. I knew more about Brum's archive than Grote ever did. I watched him fumble through legends I studied for decades. That stamp, it wasn't real, but the story, that was mine. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. I never touched Brum, I swear. But when he died, I saw a window. If the collection went up in flames, who'd remember the holes in the ledger? Only me. You built a legacy on silence, Wolfe said, and people began dying to preserve it. Hella's lips quivered. I didn't want money. I wanted to be believed. Sometimes that's worse. Wolfe leaned back, eyes half-lidded. Obsession, he said, is not a flaw, per se. It is an engine. But like all engines, it requires friction and the delusion of permanence. Margaret, seated again, listened with folded hands. The others had the look of men after a flood, wet, winded, and wondering if they'd missed the ark. Wolfe went on. A stamp, like an orchid, has no intrinsic value. It is paper, ink, colour. What we pay for is the echo, the hand that once licked it, the myth it carried. He tilted his head toward Hella. When that echo is faked, we lose more than money. We lose the belief that rarity means truth. He let that settle. A thing's worth, Wolfe murmured, is not in who owns it, but in who can walk away. He glanced at the clock. Archie, conclude. I reached for the matches, lit a cigar, and let the smoke curl like a question mark. We started with a curse and ended with a mirror. Funny thing about stamps, though, the more rare they are, the less likely they're real. Wolfe drank his beer like a man settling a debt with gravity. Not a word, not a glance, just the gentle clink of glass against coaster and the orchestral hum of silence that follows a successful hanging. Metaphorically speaking. I'd seen him quiet before, usually post-feast, post-confrontation, or post-revelation. But this one had a different temperature. The beer was cold. The air was not. You could feel it in your collarbone. He hadn't spoken since Margaret left with her leather folder, an unreadable face. I didn't prod him. I know when the machinery's still whirring behind the curtain. You don't throw wrenches at engines still cooling. He leaned back. A small exhale. Not victory, not relief. Something else. Something that smelled faintly of burned paper and moral compromise. And that's when Fritz entered, bearing trout amandine. Fritz had outdone himself. Again. The trout was golden on the edges, flaky at the fork's insistence, and smugly nestled against white asparagus that had been whispered into tenderness. Wolfe didn't speak, didn't even grunt. But the way his napkin unfurled said everything. He ate like a man reclaiming his kingdom. Me, I mostly pushed mine around. It's not that I lack appreciation. Fritz's asparagus could turn diplomats. But something about the quiet across the table made me chew more slowly than usual. Wolfe was digesting more than lunch, and I didn't want to get caught in the reflux. I glanced toward the windows. A breeze was flirting with the curtains. The kind of afternoon that makes you wonder if justice, when served, ever really fills you. And then, over coffee, I decided to say it aloud. The whole twisted yarn, from the ghost stamp to the ledger's lie. You know, I said, twirling the sugar spoon but not using it. I've seen dames start wars, oil barons sink fortunes, and jazz singers ruin 3 marriages in a single set. But I think this is the first time I've watched a stamp destroy a room full of men. Wolfe didn't respond, which was fine. I wasn't talking for him. 1/4 inch of perforated deceit, 3 reputations frayed, 2 careers in shreds, and enough ego bruises to start a cosmetic line. I grinned. And the damn thing wasn't even real. Wolfe finally looked up. Not annoyed, not amused, just watching. Broom's death, Hella's ego, Grote's betrayal, Margaret's liberation, all orbiting a lie wrapped in cellophane. I leaned back. 1 stamp too many, or maybe 1 truth too few. That got a hum out of him, barely audible. But with Wolfe, that's like applause. And then, after coffee, he retreated to his sanctuary of chlorophyll and symmetry. I gave him an hour before entering the orchid room. It's polite to let the lion lick its wounds in solitude, even if it's the other animals that got mauled. He didn't look up as I stepped inside. He was misting the rare Van der Coerulea like it was a stubborn diplomat. "They are rare," he said, mid-spray. "Not because they are beautiful. That's a common misconception. Plenty of beautiful things are common." I stayed by the door. Wolfe gets philosophical when the orchids start to whisper. "They are rare," he continued, "because they require impossible conditions. Temperature, pH, humidity, and above all, patience. They thrive only when the world bends to them, never the reverse." He turned toward me, fingers resting on a leaf's edge. "That is what the collectors never understood. Rarity is not value. It is burden." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because he needed someone to hear it. And then the doorbell rang, and Fritz brought the envelope. The envelope was thin, government grade, and grim in colour. I opened it while Wolfe examined his cuticles. It read in Kramer's patented caveman script. "You were right. Don't make me say it twice. See." I read it aloud. Wolfe made a sound that might have been a sneeze or a scoff. Then he held out his hand. I passed it to him. He read it with the speed of a man absorbing a parking ticket, then dropped it unceremoniously into the wastebasket. But not before folding it once. A small, silent nod to the rare pleasure of acknowledgement, even from a man who'd rather gargle nails than say thank you. 2 days later, the papers confirmed what we already suspected. Margaret Vale had donated the Brum collection, forged entries and all, to the Smithsonian. No auction, no fanfare, just a 5-line press release and a blurry photograph that caught her mid-blink. I clipped it for Wolfe's files, but kept the photo for myself. There was something in her face, not victory, not righteousness, relief, the kind you get after burning down a house you never wanted to live in. Wolfe barely reacted. "A sensible act," he said. "When the past is smoke, you stop searching for the source and breathe something else." I liked that. I wrote it down. But later, when I went to file the stamp remnants, I found something in the drawer Wolfe never uses. Something square and faintly perfumed. It was tucked in a plain white envelope. No markings except a faint smudge of ash. Inside, the forged stamp, the infamous Molnar blue that never was. Or maybe always was, depending on your appetite for fiction. I didn't take it to Wolfe. I didn't burn it either. I slid it into my desk drawer, under the old boxing stub and the photo of Lily Rowan at Belmont. "Just in case," I muttered. Because sometimes, what you don't display tells the real story, and some lies, once beautifully told, deserve a quiet corner. I've been around long enough to know the difference between rare and real, not always the same animal. Truth is, the stamp wasn't the real con. The lie that mattered, the one that cost lives and peeled paint off pride, was this: that something rare, once touched, could ever be owned. Brum thought he owned it. Heller tried to claim it. Grote priced it. Margaret freed it. Me? I locked it away and walked out for a sandwich. Because when you spend enough time around collectors, you start to see the danger isn't in the hoarding, it's in the wanting. Maybe the real curse was thinking anything rare ever truly belongs to anyone. Some things, like stamps, are made to be sealed, neatly framed, hidden behind glass. But people are never so tidy. In the quiet aftermath of deduction, what lingered wasn't the forgery, or even the deaths, but the aching hunger for possession, for something rare, something untouchable, to belong to us and no one else. Wolfe, as always, returned to his orchids. I returned to my desk, and the forged stamp, well, it stayed in the drawer, just in case. What do you think? Was the real crime the murder? Or the belief that beauty must be owned to be admired? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.